experience. And I think the experience is what customers value. So, I would say really focus, the product is the experience.
Product is, okay. Now, CK, do you agree with the metaphysical question and answer that a product is the experience?
Yes, it is. It is the experience. It's a really tricky question, though. It's a fun question to talk about to begin with. As Max was saying before we got started, everything was product a couple of years ago. Now everything is becoming an as a service. So software as a service, revenue as a service. So everything is becoming as a service. So it's pretty interesting. Based on the definitions of today, especially looking at software products, in my mind, there are two attributes that makes a product. The first one is something that adds value to the customer, which brings back Max's point about experience. And the second one is some form of reusability, right? So it's always easy to compare a product with service. So if someone's building a house, if you want a specific house built in a specific way, you will go and build a house for you. That would be a service. But there's an apartment that a lot of people can reuse, and hey, it works for 80% of the people, then it's a product. Again, it's tricky because the definition is tricky here, but something that adds value and something that's reusable that can be benefited by 80% of the masses potentially.
Well, there you go. The question of the day, what is product? And the definitions here, which I like, is the fact that it has to be some type of experience. It's got to add value, and there's a reusability component. That is probably just the tip of the product iceberg. And we are here today live on the ScaleUp Heroes podcast. We've got Max, we've got CK, and we've got a lot of discussion to have around scaling product. And my name is Ryan Foland. I speak about simplicity across the world and how to create clarity through confidence, what you're saying. And we have a very confident and very capable guest today because she is part of a company that some would consider a unicorn. And we're going to learn about how she and her team have offices all over the world to deliver product, and not only deliver, but scale it. So before we kick off the show, I want to remind anybody who is close to London that we actually have an actual meetup. So we have these podcasts every week, and now we're going to IRL, in real life. It's going to be the London meetup. It's going to be Wednesday, March 6th from 7 to 8 p.m. And it's going to be how to align product and engineering teams when you're facing hyper growth, not just regular growth. And we've got Dave from Paddle. We've got Max, who's going to be there, Maria from Sync. And if you want to register, go to the ScaleUp Academy Facebook page. Now, that is our selfish plug, but it's not selfish because it's for you. Well, let's kick off the conversation. Max, take it away. Let's meet who CK is, and then let's talk product, and then product, and then product.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ron. CK, thank you so much for taking the time. I'm really looking forward to this conversation, especially with the place that you're at in your career, but also the place that Talkdesk is at the moment. I've been lucky enough to work in a number of companies and organizations where you work in a number of different locations, and I know that you're facing similar challenges at the moment. So I'd love to hear about yourself and Talkdesk and the challenges that you've got about working distributed. So let's start. Let's jump into it.
First of all, thanks for having me here. It's a pleasure. Maybe I'll start with a little bit of context. CK, Charanya, Kannan, you can call me CK. I head product at Talkdesk. Talkdesk started about 5 to 6 years ago. We started as 0, 2, 3, 4 people, and today we're about 500 plus. We have offices in 6 different locations, and with some of the offer acceptance just about 10 minutes ago, just my team, which is product and design team, is in 8 locations. So we've grown really fast, and towards the end of this year, we're hoping to reach 1,000. Keeping my fingers crossed. And it's very interesting because one of my most favorite statements someone made a couple of years ago was, talent is all around the world, but opportunities are not. So given that talent is all around the world, in the product team, the way we've started hiring is not only people who are in the locations where we have offices, but we have people in locations where we don't have offices who completely work remotely. So it's a fairly distributed team, and it's been a lot of fun so far.
Fantastic. And I think the aspiration to be up to 1,000 people, I think you're sort of 1-2 years ahead of where we are here at Monese. So I'm super excited to sort of get the inside track and be able to sort of navigate these winds and seas of growth as we get there. I think for me, I've worked in a number of different organizations across a number of different countries, and that combined with scaling is like a double problem. You've got communications issues and you've got growing issues. Let's dive straight into it. And I'd really like to understand what you think the biggest challenges are, with these people in so many different places.
Sure. Yeah, I have. Again, there are multiple challenges. I'll probably go through some of them. Just to begin with, if I have to put all of them in one word, I would say the biggest challenge really is habit. Most companies, the revolution of distributed teams have only been around for the last 5-6 years, right? So like 10 years ago, you would have seen advertisements that said, you have to relocate to San Francisco or you have to relocate to London to be a part of this job. But in the last 5 to 6 years, that has changed. You can work completely remotely. And many companies and many people, including us, are probably going through the transition of being in totally co-located team to being in distributed teams. And one of the major challenges that I see with people and with myself sometimes is habit. And what I mean by habit is a lot of times we're so used to lobby conversations and, talking to people that sit right next to us and, kind of like sharing information with people that are around us. And I think it's, although you have the right mindset, you have to make a conscious decision of changing that habit and really translating those lobby conversations into something that's on a video with the team. So I think habit is something that I think is one of the major challenges. But to be more precise there, most of the challenges I can kind of probably put in 3 categories. The first one is context, because you're constantly talking to the team in terms of what needs to be done, but you also need to share why that needs to be done. And a lot of that why, again, usually used to happen in the lobby conversation. Like, by the way, we're doing this because of this, right? So, but when you have distributed team, that you need to find a better way to share that context to pretty much everyone in the team. So I think that's kind of one of the first challenges in distributed teams. Of course, people have solved it, so all of these are solvable, but that's probably the first. The second one is culture. And even in distributed teams, when you have, like I had a team in India, Ukraine, Canada, East Coast, and West Coast of US. It was really interesting. In a couple of years ago, once I told a guy, hey, you're kicking ass, right? I just sent him an email. He was doing such a fantastic job. I sent him an email saying, you're kicking ass. And then after some time, the next day, no response. Next day, he sends me an email saying, hey, am I doing okay? Why did you say I'm kicking ass? I think he took it as he's probably not doing a good job. So, like when you're using words and terminologies, be really careful. Don't assume that people know kind of like the way you speak. Although everyone speaks English, I think the cultural differences was an interesting one. And then the last bucket that I would say is empathy, because when you're with a person in the same room, you see how they react, you see their facial reaction. It's a lot easier to empathize, right? When they say something, that person, that they wouldn't make a mistake. So you're like, okay, she is doing that because of this reason. But when you don't have the personal connection, it's hard to empathize with someone else. So it's very easy to point fingers and say, hey, them versus us, I don't know why she's thinking about it this way, and all of that areas. So kind of empathizing with people remotely versus, someone who sits right next to you is a lot more easier when the person sits right next to you. So you, again, need to make a conscious decision of, like going above and beyond to empathize with people across teams. Okay.
No, I think that's really interesting in terms of context, culture, and and empathy. I think those buckets are really, really spot on. And I loved your post about habit forming, but obviously creating a habit, as we all know, going to the gym, not eating sugar, January. It's hard work. So how do you? I'd love to dive into those 3 buckets, but first, I'd really love to explore how do you make habits for yourself, and then after you got into that, then perhaps how do you instill habits in other people, which is for me the sort of the very interesting, challenging question.
Yeah. And by the way, don't get me started on gym and sugar, because I've never been able to figure that habit out. But yeah, I think it's a good question of how do you really create that habit for yourself and for the team. There are multiple things that I would say there. I think the habit starts at the top, right? So I think, I think one of the discussions that we were going to have was about how do you make sure that across locations, you can still have a good discussion, you can still have a good debate, argument, and come to a conclusion that makes sense for the company. And the habit in many cases starts from the top. So for example, when you go to a meeting, do not start the meeting with, hey, I have an opinion, what do you think? It may work when everyone is in the same location, but in distributed teams with different culture, people don't speak up, right? They don't open up. So from the top, from the CEO, state the outcome, state the context, and leave an open-ended question for people to respond and think about and have an argument, right? And I think it starts from the top, because once your CEO starts doing it, once your head of product starts doing it, people are more open to opening up, disagreeing, which it's a really good thing to disagree and still come to a conclusion that makes sense for the entire company. So I think habit starts from top, from your CEO, from your exec team to everyone else.
Okay. I think it's interesting. Role modeling, I do see, I spent quite a bit of my career in the military, and obviously that is very heavily, you're very heavily trained and educated to lead by example. And I think that is probably one of the most important tools that you have as a leader in terms of sort of walking the walk. Your question on your point about open questions is really interesting. How do you, because I think what I've learned is that I found there's a place for open questions and there's a place not to use open questions.
Yeah.
It can sort of get away from you, and you sort of open up the solution quite widely. So how do you stop that? How do you keep the open question to get that feedback, but avoid going off on a tangent or addressing the wrong problem or addressing the wrong question?
Yeah, it's really tricky. That's why, there are multiple things there, just thinking out loud. First is deciding between when you want to open it up for questions versus not. Right? Because again, your time is really precious. You need to make sure that every meeting has the right outcome. So when do you want to open it up for questions versus not? But in areas where you want to open it up for questions, I heard somewhere about the statement that computers are stupid because they can only answer, they cannot ask the question. Now, of course, that's changing with artificial intelligence and whatnot today. But the hardest part is really framing the right question and making sure that question again, gives the context, gives the outcome, and then you frame the question in such a way that you don't go tangentially in multiple different areas. So I think, again, like most of the time that as a leader you need to spend potentially is to frame the right question versus framing the answer so that the team can frame the answer for you.
I think that's really empowering. I think that also, the positive part of that is, if you ask the question, you can see what the answer is, and you can then test, okay, is my perception as well? Because if they're coming up with something that's very, very different, you obviously know there's an information gap there that you've not bridged, you wouldn't uncover that if you said, right, here's my hypothesis, this is, and you wouldn't uncover it. So I think that's a very clever thing.
And it's interesting because I've gone into a lot of these meetings with an opinion, still opening up with a question. And of course, in some meetings, I felt, hey, maybe my opinion is better. But in most meetings, I feel someone else's opinion was much better than mine. And if I had really started with stating that opinion, chances are, again, it depends on personality and culture. Chances are we would have just stuck with that opinion versus getting people's feedback. I would say 7 out of 10 times, the opinion that people come back with and the feedback that we get from them is much better than what I would have thought was the right thing to do going into the meeting.
And I think that's really powerful because that allows you the faith that you sort of share the perception, and that you've got the faith and trust in the team to come. The product, whatever the product may be. Ryan, I think we had a discussion on what the product was at the start of the show. But the product, the customer best, and you're the best people to come up with an answer. And I'm here as a sounding board, a potential voice of challenge. Because as a leader, you have a different context, you're exposed to different information, and this allows you to check your perspective as well as check the team's perspective. So I think it's a very powerful. I think this is a little bit of a dangerous topic, but I do think there are cultural differences. How have you found navigating what is a potential minefield in terms of managing different cultures and coming up with this candid, open approach across different cultures?
I think the step one there is really knowing the culture really well. So again, like working with different cultures and teams, I keep sharing this with my team quite often. It's very interesting where in few cultures, it's just like super blunt, hey, this just doesn't make sense. and then you have a conversation. I find it really easy. I appreciate that because you don't have to think about what the other person is thinking, right? They're just like super open. In some cultures, that's not necessarily the case, and that's okay. I think really the starting point is understanding that culture really well. Knowing that, again, it's a tricky part because when you say understanding the culture, you still cannot stereotype the entire culture, right? So each person still is different and they have their own nuances and ways of doing things. But there are some common traits between 70 to 80% of the people, based on their culture, right? So I think understanding the culture is really important. And then based on that, depending on which culture do you have in the meeting, approaching it based on that. So for example, if you have cultures where they're really open, sometimes I've gone into a meeting, before I go into a meeting, I have a one-on-one with a few people saying, hey, I know you're very opinionated, fantastic, I really, really love it. But for this meeting, let's have, these people talk first, and then you can share your opinion. And it has worked because if I have to say that in the meeting in front of like 20 people, it doesn't work. So sometimes I take it up offline, talk to them, and then go to the meeting so everyone's voices can be heard there.
I think, wargaming or preparing before big meetings, especially, board meetings or other things like that, I think, exactly right. Or with external, with third parties, you as a leader and your team would say things in a very different way if you're just all in the same company or all in the same team versus if you've got people who are external there. And I love what you meant about what you said about not falling into the trap of, blandly applying, an entire, view to a group of people. I think that's very smart. I think you've got you learning the culture, but also learning the people as well on an individual level, because there is, as you said, there's always variance. And I think building on top of what you're saying, there's a bit about building the culture. And I know you spend a lot of time traveling. We were talking about it before the start of the show, but then obviously building those personal relationships so you can apply the individual lens. You talked about traveling a lot and seeing the people in, I'm assuming from that, my assumption is that you see the huge importance to face-to-face. I'd love to explore that a bit more. How often do you go? Why do you travel? What do you do to sort of, to break beyond the sort of the national stereotypes or cultural stereotypes to really get to know people? I'd love to find out.
Sure, sounds good, yeah. So I think however much we have distributed remote teams, some level of in-person meetings. I think Ryan used this word IRL. What did you say IRL was?
Yeah, it's in real life.
Yes, that was the first time I'm hearing that, so I'm going to remember that next time. So I think some form of in real life is really important, right? Especially in the first few months or first year of the company, because you may or may not know the culture, right? So in some cases you do, because right now everything is so distributed that some cultures, you don't know some cultures. So first, to understand the culture, spending some time with a team there is really important. And then knowing each individual as much as possible personally, because for me to, for example, grab a person one-on-one and say, hey, don't voice your opinion just yet. It's a lot more easier when I know the person versus telling someone that I don't know, right? It doesn't really come across the right way. So knowing people individually is important as well. And then once you know that, again, you're able to empathize much better in terms of why she's asking you to do that. So you're able to trust the person much better. So I've been pretty lucky in the sense that first, I don't have a lot of travel restrictions. So I travel to my team as much as possible, especially the first few months, years. And for example, I joined Talkdesk about 9 to 10 months ago. I probably spent like 40% of my time in Portugal because we have a huge team there. And then for teams across the rest of the regions or locations, we have a quarterly offsite where we bring the entire team together so we can get to know each other and have a good discussion about the product.
Is that the leadership team or your team or every quarter?
So it's every quarter when we do this in Portugal, for example, it's the entire team. When we do this in US, it's the team across everywhere in US, so not necessarily just the leadership team. There will be like some sections of that just for the leadership team, but we would have like one day for the entire team.
Sure. I'd like to dive into this a bit more. How do you approach that? Do you have meals with people? Do you go out after work? And how do you sort of understand the team a bit more, and how do you understand the sort of the people?
Yeah. So it's a combination of two things. One is, of course, not one of the things about having remote meetings, distributed teams is when you get on a meeting, right? So when you get on a Zoom meeting, we're all work all the time. So it's all professional talk, because when you get on a Zoom meeting and you start talking about your husband and your dog, it feels like you're wasting somebody else's time. But when everyone is sitting right next to you, you talk about your husband and your dog all the time, right? Because you have like a little bit of time in between. So you really get to know people on a personal level, which hardly happens in Zoom meetings. So having these offsites really helps. So at Talkdesk, actually I was pleasantly surprised because Talkdesk really knows how to have good offsites. So we have a great outing now in Portugal, where we had the entire company in Portugal, where we went for an offsite. It was a 2-day team building activity. And the most interesting part is I communicate with maybe 30-40% of them on a regular basis. There are so many people that I've not communicated with in the past. It was so interesting to see how many leaders there are in the organization just based on those team building events. So some form of team building events across is really important, because you get to know about the person a lot more. And then, of course, we do have offsites, which is just, let's talk about the strategy. Let's talk about what we want to do for the next 12 months, and then really have like an argument, disagreement, and then come to a conclusion in terms of what we want to be able to do there.
When I'm hearing what you're saying, it makes me think of a sporting analogy, almost as though there's a coach, and then there's the team, and there's these different players with different strengths. So my question to you is, how, as this leader who is really a coach that you're talking about this, how do you go about finding the captain of the team and the assistant captain of the team? And as you're managing these scaling teams across multiple cultures and across multiple playing fields, are there any things that you do to find those individuals who might become leaders in those subdomains, might become the captain of the team, maybe giving them a little bit more power and autonomy, supporting them in their personal brand? How do you pick and choose the leaders to help you as you build this?
Yeah, it's definitely it's very important. It's very tricky as well, because when you're bringing in leaders that are completely remote, you need to be able to bring in folks that are completely self-driven, right? So, who are kind of like entrepreneurs who do anything it takes across regions to make it happen. So it's not easy to be able to hire the right people. But I think a couple of things that goes on in my mind. The first one is anyone that you hire, for me, needs to be better than me, right? So they need to be better than you, and the team that your leaders hire need to be better than them. So a lot of times when we hire folks, we're hiring people based on complementing skill sets, sometimes followers, but that doesn't really work. So you're in completely different locations. Hire people who are better than you, who can be leaders. The second one that I've done in some organizations, and Talkdesk, we're still figuring out what's the best way to do, is your leaders need to have some form of P&L responsibility for their product area. So, a lot of times people use this word product managers are like the CEO of the organization. Few people accept, few people vehemently oppose that. But the point there is, if you owned the P&L, and if you're really responsible for the success and failure of that product and business, then you're kind of empowered enough to make the right decisions, right? So, you have the team, you have the budget, you have to hire, you have to make it happen with no excuses. But really, like, you own the success and failure of the product, which is what I mean by owning the P&L of the product as well. So again, hiring someone that's better than you, that's in some cases been there, done that, but has the right attitude, most importantly, and giving them the empowerment of P&L responsibility, I think is helped. In some cases, you also need to know when it's not working and what do you do about that, right? Because when you hire remote teams, every single person have to be a self-starter, self-driver. So you need to be able to assess when it's not working and then make the right call based on that as well.
I think that's a really interesting point. Says, we at Monese, we have, empowering the product leads a lot. Ideally being able to say no to anybody, including the CEO, including risk and compliance. Obviously, if you say no to risk and compliance, you've got to have a very good justification for doing that. But how do you make sure that people are making the good quality decisions, especially remotely? It's very difficult in person. How do you sort of really dive into that and see these decisions and check these decisions?
It was interesting. So I was telling you about the offsite we had a couple of days ago. My CEO was kind of saying, yeah, it's right in most cases, but he was saying this statement, which I thought was really interesting. He said, there is no right or wrong decision. There is just lack of decision making. So we all know that. So you can make decisions based on data. There are companies that have started based on extreme database decision making, and they've still not been successful. You can make decision based on gut, but that also has its plus and minus. End of the day, any decision that you make, you're going to do the best that you can based on data, validated with multiple people, validated with customers, but it could be wrong, and that's okay. So the first one for anyone is to know that it's okay to make wrong decisions. It's not okay to not make decisions, right? So it's not okay to wait until your head of product or your CEO makes a decision for you. So that I would say is the first thing, making sure that they know they have to make the decision. It's totally okay if they make the wrong decision. We're an agile and nimble company to be able to recover and change from that. And then any decision that's made, making sure that everyone is aware of that decision when applicable, right? So you need to make that call and make people aware so that everyone's kind of following through the same decision as well.
So I think the point about not making a decision, it always reminds me the Band of Brothers analogy from a long time ago. Just remember the sergeant saying he wasn't a bad leader because he made bad decisions. He was a bad leader because he made no decisions.
Yeah,
that always has stuck with me.
Yeah.
But I think one of the things that I found helpful, one of the analogies I found helpful is driving. If you get in a car, you're trained, you've got your license, you know where you're going, you're driving, and you have an accident. Fine. These things happen.
Yeah.
But if you're drink driving, it doesn't matter if you've crashed the car. Just the act of drink driving, is a mistake. So I sort of class sort of my role as trying to find drink drivers, preferably before they crash.
Yeah.
And sort of keeping an eye on that, looking at the quality of decision making. Are these people looking at the right data? Have they done the homework? Challenging the thought process behind it. The ultimate decision is theirs, but I want to sort of make sure that I've got this sort of emergency button for the customer and the company, which can go, okay, you're drink driving. It's not that I disagree with your decision. I just disagree that I disagree that I think you're making bad decisions in general.
Yeah.
So let's stop and let's talk about the decision making, not about this one decision, but about the fact that I think you're making those bad decisions. That analogy has been really helpful for me.
Right.
And also talking it through with the product leads is sort of, it's up to you whether you drive the car. But if I think you've been at the source, then this is a bit of a different conversation.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that I've kind of shared with most of the product leads that I've worked with is, you and your engineering counterpart think that you guys are the co-founders of the company and think that you are putting money from your pocket, right? This is a private company. This is your money that you're putting into the company. If that was the case, if this was your money and this was your company and you were the co-founders, 1, would you not make a decision? 2, would you give any excuses? 3, would you point finger at anyone else? Probably not, right? Because you have a stake in the company and you're making, anything it takes to make that your company successful. So think about it as you and your engineering counterpart as a co-founder, and you guys are making the call. And I'm just an investor, right? So think about I'm going to approve you, because even the co-founders and CEOs have a boss, right? So you're investors. Think about me more as an investor. You guys are the co-founders who's going to make this happen. For few people, that works really well. For few, not necessarily, because again, you need to have that mindset for that. But in many cases, that's kind of what I expect from the team as well, because this is your company, it's your money. You have to make it successful, make the right decisions, and it's okay to fail.
No, I think that's incredibly powerful. I think, how do you, especially with distributed teams, how do you get into it? How do if a team's coming up to you and making a decision that you would disagree with, or even worse, can't understand? How do you get into it to really sort of, you want to give them this power, but then there's sort of this flashing alarm bell going off. How do you sort of get into it?
Sure. Yeah, I think it depends on what is the forum for disagreement, right? So we have meetings where we have 50 people versus we have meetings where we have 4 to 5 people. So as much as possible, if it's a decision that I specifically don't agree, I think having it in a smaller forum and really understanding that context once again. Because more than disagreeing, I may still disagree, but I may be wrong, right? So I think the first one, you start with, okay, what's the outcome that we want to accomplish for the company? not for you or me, but what's the outcome we want to accomplish for the company? What is the context for that outcome, right? So your outcome could be, I want to kill this specific competition. And then context is, why do I want to do that today? Why is there a sense of urgency versus why can't this be done next year? So giving the context, and then kind of talking it through with that person who gave that idea that I may or may not agree with, going through, okay, so if we did this, does it help the outcome? If we did this, does it help the context? And then I really need to have an opinion in terms of if I don't agree with an idea, why, right? And then we kind of talk through it. And I truly do believe that after talking through that, I might change my mind, or I may be successful in changing the other person's mind. But if the outcome is achieved and the context is set right, at least we can have that good conversation to see if that's a good decision or not.
I think you touched on something quite important there, which is the difference between sort of whether you agree with somebody versus whether you understand the decision. And what I found is, 90% of the problems that I have is, everybody's actually saying the same thing. They just misunderstand each other or the context. And it's only the 10% of the time where people actually just fundamentally disagree. But with distance and distributed teams, that's really tough. Sort of, do you phone people up? Do you jump on a Skype? Do you even fly out to see people? Like, sort of, how do you get that tacit knowledge beyond what I think doesn't work as Slack, what I think doesn't or doesn't work as text message? I've got that very wrong in the past. How do you get beyond that into sort of really understanding? Trying to make sure, is this a misunderstanding or we just disagree? How do you get into that?
Yeah, I think the good thing is now pretty much at Talkdesk and most of the other companies where when you get on a video, you're on a video, right? So you can see each other's face, which is really important. In the past, I had one-on-ones and I had meetings, and we kind of stuck to those meetings and one-on-ones. Once again, like, you don't have that lobby type conversation in video. So what we did right now is, as much as possible, if I have to talk to someone like right now for like 20 minutes, I don't wait until my next one-on-one. I just ping them and ask, hey, can we get on a call? Can we get on a call for like 15 minutes? And there are so many such 15, 20 minutes conversations I have in my pajama pants, because I wake up, I remember something, and then like the first thing I talk to the team. So having such more frequent conversation helps first in setting the context, because I do think that if someone is giving an idea that I totally don't agree with, in many cases, it's because I did not set the right context. Mm-hmm. And it's mostly because I don't have time, I'm traveling, right? I talk something to the CEO, so I have a lot more context, but I haven't done a good job of passing that context to every single person in the team. So, first you talk to the person, explain the context, just as a casual conversation, and then talk about it. In most cases, this has gotten resolved. There's been maybe one or two in the last like 5 years where I've completely opposed a point of view of someone else, although our context and everything else matched.
And what happened then? Because what's always dangerous is you're empowered until I disagree with you, and then.
So I think the question is, okay, so if you agree that that decision will also help the outcome and context, the question is, what is the risk in trying that? If the cost of trying that is pretty small, try it out. You may be wrong. Somebody may, because ultimately it's the outcome for the company. If it's his idea or her idea and it works, fantastic. Mm-hmm. So if the cost of doing that is fairly small, you just try it out. If the cost of doing that is high, then you figure out a better way to validate that, right? It's not you versus me. End of the day, it's customer. End of the day, it's business. So how do you validate it better with some form of a prototype or proof of concept or pitch deck or whatever you call it, right? So how do you validate? But if the cost is not too high, just try it out. Just do something pretty small, try it out and validate it, because you could totally be wrong and the other person could be right.
And I think, so when we talk about empowerment a lot, and I'm sure you do, and lots of other people do, and in some of the other organizations I've worked in, but you're empowered until your boss disagrees with you, and you don't have any power. You're empowered without the power, which really doesn't work. And And I think your point about context is just really powerful. I think on that, especially with distributed teams, what I've been thinking through at the moment, and I'd love to get your sort of thoughts, is the difference between sort of push communication and pull communication. Because, I could set up like loads of meetings and tell everybody the same thing again and again and again. It's going to be very boring for them, not going to be productive. But where's the burden on me informing the context of the team versus them pulling it? And how can we, what are your tips on sort of getting that balance right, or how to do either better?
Yeah, it's interesting. I'll give an example from what one of my previous CEOs did that I absolutely love. But yeah, push communication versus pull. At this point in time, we kind of use a combination of both. It is a lot of push as well, in some cases pull. The good thing is some tools today, like Slack and others, they've kind of figured out the pull communication model more, right? So it's not like, hey, I'm going to send this announcement email or a product summary email that everyone's going to look at. Everyone's asking for info and anyone can give that info. So that's really helping out in that pull side of things. But one of the things that I really liked a previous CEO of mine did was, I thought it was brilliant. So any information you have to share, I think 8 times or something before it registers in the person's head. And if you go to any company, most of the times, especially in startups, like, hey, I don't know the strategy. I don't know the vision. What is your strategy and vision? If you go and ask execs, they always feel, we have shared the strategy and vision. What are you talking about? So it was interesting because my previous CEO, he used kind of like the same deck to share the strategy and vision. He's done that multiple times. And we used to have this yearly company kickoff, sales kickoff, quarterly offsites, and all that fun meetings. And what he did was he would put like an hour and a half or 2 to say company strategy. And what he did in that time is he wouldn't present the strategy. He would have the slides. We had this huge ball that gets passed to people. You would pass it on to the first person. He has to talk about that first 1 or 2 slides in terms of, overall strategy. And that person would pass the ball to somebody else and they'll have to talk about the strategy. It was really funny because we've heard him talk about strategy and vision so many times. You feel like you know it on a high level, but when you have to present it, it's like you don't realize how hard it is to kind of like say the same thing, right? The first 1 or 2 times we did this, every single person said completely opposite things. And then slowly we kind of put a script together for what our strategy is. And everyone started saying the same thing. This was because a lot of times you can tell for like 20 times, but someone else kind of grasping that and repeating it in an aligned strategy way is really important. And I thought he did a really good job of that. So rather than you pushing it all the time, have others push it for you, right? So they can actually share the strategy themselves.
No, yes.
Sorry, Max, taking that kind of one step further, how do you see I would almost call these no-collar workers, a distributed team that have their own autonomy. How do you see them as ambassadors for your company and ambassadors for growth? And how crucial is it that they can communicate that brand mission and value in what they do as you move from now to 1,000 employees? Are your current employees a big part of that growth strategy? How do you leverage them?
Yeah, I don't know if I have a simple answer for that, but definitely at least, my goal will be for the next level, right? So the mid-managers, so the next level leaders to be completely aligned with what I'm saying. My CEO's goals should be for me to be completely aligned with him, right? So I think, of course, you can share it with really broad audience, but every person should make sure that your direct reports at least have 100% alignment in terms of how you would talk about the strategy and vision so that they can go and empower others. I think in some cases, again, if you're all sitting in the same room, it's a lot more easier, but it's not really hard because, every single person doesn't have more than like a maximum of 20 reports, right? Anywhere from 2 to 3 to 20. If you have 20 reports, it's a different problem. That's a conversation for later. But everyone, you're working very closely with maybe 10 people on a day-to-day basis. Your CEO works very closely with those 10 reports on a day-to-day basis. You absolutely are responsible to make sure that what you say as strategy and what your manager and what your team says is the same thing. And they are then responsible for empowering their teams.
How do you, I think it comes back to role modeling again, what would you expect? And I put myself in this position, if the CEO was on my team, what would he expect me to say as the leader of that team? So I use that as a sort of, to make sure that I'm on point and, and sort of trying to get across sort of the points that I think he's trying to get across and sort of the vision for the company. How do you sort of check? What mechanisms of feedback do you get to make sure? Because if you lead a team, it's quite straightforward. There's like one layer, and once you've got your 8 or 20 people, that's a big team. If those 20 people have got it, but what happens if you're doing, you're leading leaders who lead leaders, and then you're somewhat sort of filtered. How do you sort of make sure that information is being repeated, the right information is being repeated, and it's getting down to everybody?
I think so. One of the things we do at Talkdesk, for example, is every quarter my CEO goes and sits with each team, and then they share what they've done. He kind of shares the strategy. They have an open conversation. So although you're kind of sharing the strategy with your teams, it's so much better for them to directly hear from the CEO as well. So we only started doing that for the past about 2 to 3 releases, and that's helped a lot because they can always hear from their product manager. They can always hear from me. They can always hear from their manager, but hearing directly from the CEOs is a whole different thing. So that I think has helped a lot. Because you're like, you do a lot of things and you need to be able to put all of those together and then connect it to why we are doing this and what's the goal for a year or 2 from now. And having those direct meetings with the CEO help the team as well. So that's, I think, potentially one way. And the other one is, I think today it's kind of interesting. You have so many tools. I would always say don't rely on tools because tools are just tools, right? Don't rely on tools. But there are so many tools today. There are tools that basically, you could record your 3 minutes elevator pitch, or you could record your strategy and then post it on Slack and things like that. So everyone can take a look at it. So that way, it's all in one place, right? So there's a tool where you can just record any conversation that you have, and all the recordings are in one place. You can always go take a look at it. If there's something that someone is relaying the strategy in a different way than how you would do it, then give that person a feedback and change it. So it's not really siloed. I think there are tools today that has made collaboration better and kind of content in one place. So that's helping as well.
I think that the point on video is quite a very sort of that's spot on. We've just realized this relatively recently. So we've created a channel in Slack, which is kickoffs and updates. And whenever somebody's going to create a big new feature or something's changed, it gets kicked off properly with this, with the right people. We video it and we put the video on the slide deck in that channel, and everybody knows if there's something new in that, then something's changed. And it allows people to self-service without sort of holding another meeting.
Right.
I think that's made quite a big difference for us. And we've now said, look, we're going to try and share the information as much as possible, but you've got to hunt for it and get it. And here's an easy way to do it. And we've made it super easy.
Right. I think in the last about 3 to 5 years, the tools are becoming better, right? So before that, the tools were more push type, right? So you had to push the information for everyone to look at. In the last 3 to 5 years, it is actually improving for distributed teams. So things like strategy or things like roadmap or competitive differentiation. For all of these, now we have channels in Slack. So anyone posts information, anyone sees it. And, of course, I or some of the other people in the team, we keep a close watch so we know what people are saying. And if they're saying something that we don't necessarily agree with, then you ping that person and have a conversation about it. But I think tools have improved a lot over the last couple of years for distributed working and collaboration. And it's really helping. It still has a long way to go, but it's come a long way from the last couple of years.
Yes, I think there has been an explosion in tools. I think people started using lots and lots of them, and now we're sort of seeing people come back and try and find a few tools that do sort of things very well. And also just I know we're going to sort of run out of time soon, but I think your point about the CEO, the team having the time with the CEO, and that being a dialogue both ways, I think is something we found really powerful. We now try and get a member of the leadership team each of the teams and just say, look, we're here to listen and have a very open Q&A session. And by doing it that way, you very quickly see if if a team's off track, or if the information's not getting down, or if the context is very, very different. That's not anybody's specific fault. That's just scale. That's just building fast. Things happen. But I think just having open Q&A sessions with the CEO or a member of the leadership team, makes the team involved. It helps them sort of understand how they fit in and how their work's valuable. And it gives you as a leader the ability to sort of check the temperature of the team.
Exactly.
And to check their context. And I think that was a very powerful observation. I think we're going to wrap up there, but I think I definitely learned a lot. I'm a little bit disappointed we've run out of time. I had at least 3-4 other really interesting questions. But thank you very much. I've learned a lot, and I'm looking forward to sort of exploring a couple of these new ideas here at Monese. So thank you very much, CK. It's been fantastic.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Max and Brian. Thanks for having me. It's been fun.
Yeah. Well, before I give my breakdown that lays down all these crispy notes into a nice thought process, my favorite question at the very end is just, if you had to go back in time and deliver the best single piece of advice to somebody in your place as they begin to try to figure out how to scale a product, what would that single piece of advice be?
Don't confuse effort versus outcomes.
Okay.
So, the thing is, like, if anyone asks me, hey, how are you today? My answer is like, I'm busy, right? So we're all always busy. Every single person is always busy today. But I think sometimes having that check on, hey, is my busyness really adding to the outcome of the company or not? So in general, for product or anyone else, it's important to kind of remember effort is a completely different thing than outcome. And let's be more outcome focused than busy or effort focused. So that would be it.
I love it. Well, as I listened to this entire breakdown of how to scale product, there was a lot of things that stuck out, and I was trying to think in my brain what it relates to in real life. And the best analogy that I came up with was a number of people building Legos together. And the reason I think about that is because you talked about the three things: the context, the culture, and the empathy. And if you've ever worked together with someone and you put a whole bunch of Lego pieces together, and then you have the vision and you're like, we're going to build this type of ship, but we don't know exactly what it's going to look like. But culturally, everyone has different pieces. Culturally, everybody might go about it a different way. But at the end of the day, you have the directions and you're sort of following. So I feel like scaling product, in your experience with Talkdesk, is this combination of empowering people to go ahead and put Lego pieces in where they think, but still having an overall guideline to say, look, this is what it needs to look like. And it's empowering to put your own Legos into the system. And so the type of leadership, the servant leadership, the coaching leadership, is letting everybody build it together. And so I just have this vision of this really exciting Lego project that you know where it's going. You don't know exactly how it's going to get there, but you're letting your team continue to build it. And that's what will establish leading leaders who then lead more leaders. And if you're just talking about scaling up, it's not just about getting it done right or being active or busy. It's about everybody contributing the pieces in whatever colors, but there's got to be that connector. They all have the little nubs and they all have the little receivers. So I think that if you are scaling product, it's like you're playing with Legos from people around the world. And that just visual stuck into my head. But giving the context, understanding the culture, and having that empathy is really something that I'm seeing is more important. And you have to have those elements for people to become ambassadors, to grow, to keep them around. So I think this was refreshing. And to the very beginning, we said, what is product? I still don't think we know, but I do agree that it's got to be experiential, it's got to add value, and it's got to be reusable. So I've taken, the next time I build Legos with a team, which I'm not sure when it's going to be, I will think about this podcast and scaling product. So for everybody out there who is scaling a team, get the Legos out, make sure everybody has their pieces, and empower them to keep building this product together. If you enjoyed this discussion, which I definitely did, you can find more of these episodes on ScaleUpAcademy.io. Thank you, Max. Thank you, CK. Thank you to everyone out there who's trying to build some sort of product, whether it's disguised as a service or not. Growth only happens when you grow together. So keep it in mind, and don't forget about the cultural differences with these remote teams across communication, because the one big takeaway for me was really understand the players at the table so you can understand what pieces they're adding to the puzzle. All right, we're off. Enjoy scaling.